Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together.
Hello there, this is David Bernstein for the Counterweight Hold My Drink podcast. I'm delighted to be here for the first time, not with my partner in crime, Jennifer Richmond, who couldn't be with us today, but I am very delighted to have Valerie Tarico. Valerie is a therapist and a writer in Seattle. She's an author. She wrote an extremely important article that I had come across, Why Your Woke Therapist May Be Doing You More Harm Than Good. And I thought it was one of the most well-written, nuanced, thoughtful pieces I've read on the subject. And there unfortunately have been quite a number of articles coming from therapists and social workers and others in recent months about how the field is changing in a way that may not be good for patients. So Valerie, welcome.
Thanks. It's an honor to be on the show with you.
So normally, if I were Jennifer, I would start with this thing about what are you drinking, and but I'm, I'll leave that to her. I feel like it should. Do you have anything that you're drinking?
I do. I mean, I've watched some of your past episodes, so I came prepared.
Oh, beautiful.
And I just have to say, being, I live in Seattle in a multi-family house with 3 millennials. So what I'm drinking, it should be no surprise, is homemade kombucha. Like, what else?
Wow, that's great. I have I'm a diet tonic water. So I thought about giving myself a little shot of vodka or gin in it, but I have another one of these later. So not in the offing. But really good to talk to you. And you're concerned that ideology is sort of imposing itself in therapy. Tell me what your main concern is.
Well, let me start by saying, I guess, to back up a second and provide a little more context for who I am. As you said, I'm a psychologist and writer in Seattle. I have spent much of the last decade organizing progressive political donors to invest in, infrastructure like think tanks and youth civic engagement and voter file technology and stuff like that. So working on the left for a long time, and then my writing has largely been focused. I'm a former evangelical, and so a lot of my writing has been on religious fundamentalisms of various kinds, and then secondarily on the role of women in society, and then kind of contraceptives, kind of family planning, contraceptive technologies, abortion, et cetera. So that provides some context for my views on critical social justice, and then the way that it is coming into the therapy context. I'm no longer a practicing therapist because I have been full-time working in these other activist, kind of what I see as more leveraged activist spaces, and kind of more hands-on, change the world kind of stuff for the last decade now, but clearly coming from the left half of the political spectrum.
So we're going to have to talk about, there's a lot there, including being a former evangelical. I'm going to want to learn a little bit more about that journey. But so you've spent a lot of time as a therapist, and you wrote this very compelling article about it. Let's start there, and we'll go to some of these other areas as well, because like you, I've actually been in progressive advocacy most of my career, and find myself in some ways on the outs with my own political community now. So I'm sure we'll be able to compare notes there, but let's start with therapy and how that's changing.
So what I wrote about in the article is 4 different aspects of the way that wokeism runs counter to what we know about human well-being, psychological well-being in terms of healthy emotional functioning and relationship functioning, so internal dynamics and interpersonal dynamics. And I can just step through those 4 points, and then we can come back and talk more in depth about whatever you'd like to. So one of those dimensions, my brain is so shot now that I'm post 60, that I actually have to take notes on my own articles. But one of those point has to do with what I would call managing emotions, or the relationship between emotions and reason, in that kind of particular dimension of healthy psychological functioning. Cognitive behavioral therapies and other evidence-based therapies often work to intervene on the side of teaching people to kind of step back from their emotions, not to assume that just because you feel something that it represents reality, that our emotions are one indicator of what might be real, but they're shaped by our history, they're shaped by our ancestral history, they're shaped by human history. And so they're important. We need to kind of listen to them, but they also sometimes are either exaggerated or kind of altogether off base. And what you see in woke social justice and the way that that's coming into the therapy office then is that emotions are treated as if they were reality, that if you feel something, then that means it's true. And then you kind of take that as a starting point and go from there. So a second area where I have some concerns about the intersection between, woke social justice and psychotherapy. I guess I should back up and say, there's no good term for the subculture that I'm describing. I called it wokeism because I've also written about the quasi-religious dimensions of it. I think that John McWhorter makes a strong case there. In fact, I wrote about it before he did, if I can self-brag a bit,
Sure.
though not as beautifully and as extensively. But some people call it critical social justice. Clearly what we're talking about is a kind of subculture that is derivative of critical race theory, or critical kind of theory more broadly, and that then has gotten mixed in with social media and has taken on a bunch of social dynamics that kind of go far beyond what some of the original hypotheses about critical race theory or critical theory would have been. But anyway, so coming back to that, coming back to where we were, the second kind of way in which I think this is harmful from a therapeutic standpoint is in terms of how it treats the tribe versus our kind of shared humanity, or the individual. So I had a client once who kind of came in with something he had read that stuck with me, and it was just a brief saying that said, in some ways I am like all other people, in some ways I am like some other people, and in some ways I am like no other person, right? So if you think about those three things, and you're trying to kind of create a centered, thriving life, you want to kind of take all of those into consideration. And for most of human history, kind of identity was dominated by that middle part, by the tribe, by the ways that I'm like some other people, my group, my people. And then the Enlightenment came along and really centered itself in our shared humanity. And honestly, many of our major religious traditions move in that direction as well. Some at their best, at their worst, they kind of center us back in tribalism. And then there is the other thing that came out of the Enlightenment as a focus is the kind of the idea of our unique individuality being something that we should honor and elevate and create space for in our individual relationships and in society at large. So when I look at then that triad and where it intersects with psychotherapy, what I think that there's real risk in, the idea of woke therapists who are kind of like evangelical Christians, taught that they should always be on the make, that they're always supposed to be seeking converse, that there's only one right way to view the world, that coming into a psychotherapy relationship with that mindset, with a client who's vulnerable and trusting, means that you miss those other parts that can be profoundly important to individual empowerment. So the third part, or the third dimension that I wrote about in the article, where I think that woke culture runs counter to what we know about psychological and relationship health, is what I would call agency. So the question of where is the locus of power? And as you know, critical social justice, or wokeism, is very much talks about power dynamics as being outside of the individual, as being kind of centered in society, in terms I might use as a psychologist, more wonky terms, I talk about internal versus external locus of control. And wokeism is all about external locus of control. It's about what society is doing to you, not about the aspects of power that are centered within you as an individual and the ways that you can shape your life, work on healing, work on growth, attain goals, etc., in spite of whatever may be going on in your social context, right? So it runs very counter to, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. It runs counter to a whole lot, again, of what goes on in our, or kind of some of the best teachings of the world's great religious traditions about what it means to kind of reflect inward, to kind of find a spiritual or moral core within yourself, to establish a set of goals, and then work on living towards those or leaning into those. And then the fourth aspect that I of critical social justice theory that kind of goes head to head with what we know from evidence-based therapies and kind of human development studies has to do with relationships, right? So when you think about relationship dynamics in critical social justice, I might draw an analogy to marital therapy, right? So when people go into marital therapy and they're working on trying to find common ground, they're trying to take a bridging rather than breaking approach to their relationship dynamics, recognizing that people are imperfect, recognizing that we all have our baggage and that we come in with a history, but that we are committed to mutuality, to understanding, to being in community and in relationship with each other. And then there's another approach to relationships, right? Which is that when you go to divorce court, and it's a breaking approach, right? So at that point, not always, but at its worst, it's all about how do I catch the other person out? How do I kind of beat them? Where can I find a hole in their arguments? How can I get as much as I can? It's zero sum, et cetera. And so once again, that is a mentality. When a person moves into that mentality and starts seeing the relationships around them through that lens, that runs counter to what we know about human flourishing, both as individuals and as families.
Right. Yeah. So wokeism is not really very relational, is it? It runs counter sort of to a relational approach to the people around you. No, it's fascinating, and it's very well said. Do you have a sense of how many fellow therapists agree with you or disagree with you? Do you hear a lot about this in your own field, or do you think it's something that is sort of taking your field over, and that most people are sort of willing to go around along with it and dispense with some age-old ideas about how to do therapy well?
I don't have any statistics or numbers. What I can say is there are, I worry about it honestly being a kind of generational transition, because I feel like people in my generation were very grounded in the idea that you don't bring your stuff into the therapy room, right? That what you do is the whole process is about providing a mirror to the person and supporting their own healing or growth objectives. So that there are actually ethical principles that spell that out for master's level counselors and for psychologists. And yet, if you go into training programs now, psychology graduate programs, they are very much infused with critical theory, with kind of third wave anti-racism, and the idea that kind of, and so what you hear reported out of some of those programs is that there's not even room for conversation within the training programs that might run counter to some of those orthodoxies. There's a group that was founded by a psychologist in London called Critical Therapy Antidote, and she's created kind of a backroom social network for people in various countries, kind of folks kind of come in and sometimes talk about their experience in South Africa and Canada and the United States and other European countries, about kind of the challenges around either being a student in one of these training programs or kind of ways in which they see this coming in and starting to alter professional standards. So like if you go to, I would expect somebody going to a psychotherapist now, that it would not be hard to find someone who feels like they need to kind of maintain their own boundaries and respect, kind of what your objectives are and not feel like you have to leave therapy as a convert. But I also wouldn't assume that. So if like if somebody in my family were needing therapy at this point, I would coach them on how to ask a set of questions that would help them to determine what the therapist's mindset and approach is.
Mm. So you speak about the external versus the internal locus of control. This is not an argument that there aren't external factors that might provide impediments to people, right? You're not saying that there aren't any sources of bias or discrimination or even oppression that people might face. You're just saying it's not a productive way to do therapy. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right. So of course there's bigotry that exists in our society. I think we humans are hardwired for tribalism in a bunch of ways, and that we respond to superficial characteristics, and that regardless of our race, that those kind of instincts and instinctive bigotries are something that we need to work to challenge, both during childhood and then as we and into adulthood. Do I think there are ways in which kind of racism has gotten just incorporated into legal systems or patterns in our society that still need to be addressed? Of course. I think sometimes we confuse that with the cascading intergenerational effects of historic racism. And so sometimes we assume that the problem is current systemic racism, when in fact what the problem is that we're still dealing with the horrific toxic effects of kind of years and years of Black people or people, Mexican people or whoever kind of being subject to discrimination. So those things seem incontrovertible to me, and at the same time that I personally think that a critical approach to social justice is the wrong way. I think that it's divisive. I think that kind of centering people in racial essentialism and gender essentialism ultimately has some real potential to backfire. I think that it is kind of feeding white identity essentialism on the right part of the spectrum as well. But that's, I guess, a separate question from the one you asked, which is kind of first and foremost, I guess I wrote this article about because I feel like people need to be conscious of what's going on in the field of psychotherapy.
You actually mentioned at one point Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and it's actually about finding agency even for somebody who was facing the most extreme conditions in the Holocaust. In other words, he believed that the people who were most likely to survive the Holocaust were people who maintained some internal locus of control, despite being under the most extreme hardships that one can imagine facing a human being. And that's what got them through, by and large. They could have been killed because someone shot them or forced them into gas chambers or whatever. But even under those extreme conditions, having that mentality helped you survive. And so to say that that's a healthy way of going through life doesn't mean that one doesn't face impediments based on race, gender, or anything else, right? Yeah, go ahead.
On the other hand, so that is absolutely true, and thank you for making that point. On the other hand, if we get it wrong, if what we're seeing is something that is external to us, and that we are helpless when in fact we're not helpless, then that doesn't contribute to human flourishing, right? So again, not denying that there are challenges around ongoing bigotries, around residual systemic racism, around the cascading intergenerational effects of historic racism and sexism, et cetera. But it is very much a matter of where we put our locus of focus on problem solving or on critical theory approaches to some degree are really about, again, this is where I come back to my evangelical background. It's kind of about righteousness and about kind of the idea that people need to be kind of pummeled into confessing that they are sinners, kind of irredeemably lost, right? And then creating kind of building social dynamics around that.
Interesting question about whether what we're dealing with is a religion. I know you and John McWhorter think it is. I posed this question to an evangelical Christian and an Orthodox rabbi, both of whom are ardent critics of wokeism. Who and the evangelical Christian Neil Shenvi argued that it's less of a religion and more of a meta narrative. Now he may argue that because he doesn't want it to be characterized as a religion, which it seems like it would be a pejorative in a way, and he doesn't view religion in that way. But he would argue that it's missing certain key components that one usually associates with religion, a mystical tradition and the like. And so anyway, it's an interesting academic question, but it certainly has some things in common with religious dogma as well. So I guess I feel like I want to go there a little bit. You are a former evangelical. Tell me a little bit about your life story about becoming or being an evangelical and then breaking from your evangelical roots.
So I was raised in a Christian fundamentalist family. Dallas seminary tradition, if that means anything to you, accepted Jesus as my personal savior probably when I was 5, and then again when I was 7, and then again when I was 9, because hell was a scary place. So I grew up in that. I went to Wheaton College of Billy Graham fame, the one in Illinois, of my own choice, and found myself wrestling with the moral and rational contradictions in my worldview, and ultimately found them untenable, right? So by the time I had I came to Seattle and to do a psychology internship out here at Children's Hospital. And I was, kind of listening to people try to rationalize the suffering unto death of young children, in the cancer ward, within the context of their belief in an omnipotent, omnibenevolent interventionist deity. It just started sounding like so many rationalizations. And I realized that I'd been holding together my version of God with, duct tape and baling wire for a long time. So yes, in my mind, obviously I'm going to be, and that I've done a lot of writing about that. I wrote a book called Trusting Doubt that is a critique of kind of that kind of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity. And so I'm going to be more tuned into the negative dimensions of religion, right, than the positive dimensions. And you can think about religion as a very complex, interrelated set of cultural technologies. And absolutely, some of those are not going to be present in wokeism. But if you read John McWhorter's book, or if I wrote a 2019 article titled "The Righteous and the Woke: Why Social Justice Warriors and Evangelicals Trigger Me in the Same Way." And I lay out some of those similarities because the similarities are pretty powerful. And I don't think it's an accident that as you see the decline of Christianity in our society, that there is this concurrent rise in what I might call secular political kind of religion. So people looking to find community, looking to find a sense of righteousness, looking to find a sense of, how do I make meaning out of my life? How do I kind of find a sense of superiority, honestly? On both the left and the right, we see those things emerging. I have secret insider knowledge. I've got a vocabulary to prove it. I've got a set of kind of insular information sources that I and my fellow adherents can all agree on.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me is, a lot of the people who are critiquing wokeness, like Sam Harris and Peter Boghossian and others, these were the new atheist crowd. And now some of those new atheists sort of joined the ranks of the woke, and others didn't. And there's actually quite an interesting ideological break there. But I've heard some of the people, like, I don't think Sam Harris himself has, but some of the others say that, they're starting to think a little differently about religion than they did before, because because at least Christianity and, let's say, Judaism were calibrated for sort of Western life. They've been living side by side with sort of Western democratic culture for a long time, and over time became sort of reached a detente with it in a way that allowed the two to coexist. But yet these newer secular religions that you're talking about, and wokeism is certainly one of them, have not gone through that process, and in a way make claims that you could argue are directly in contradiction to Western democratic traditions. Is that your view as well?
Yeah. So, modern Christianity has been shaped was shaped by the Enlightenment, and then kind of, centuries of religious evolution since then, and of necessity kind of came to internalize some of those Enlightenment values around rationality. Like even evangelicalism, you look at some of the eschatological teachings, and they are sort of attempts at a pseudoscientific analysis of or application of these old theologies in a way that fits the new world, if you will. And what we're seeing now is these emergent religions, it's are largely unfettered, whether they're secular, whether it's kind of New Age spirituality, whether it's some of the Scientology and other kinds of emerging cults. They aren't kind of bound to rationality in the same way they aren't bound to being moderated or tempered by tradition. In fact, part of what they revel in is in casting that aside. So what you see in wokeism coming back again, like when it is often a repudiation of the scientific method, a repudiation of individuality, of even kind of the tools of representative democracy, et cetera. And that again creates a challenge in the therapeutic context, because I'm sitting here talking about, well, we have these evidence-based therapies that we've been honing and refining over the course of now more than a generation, and we're talking about kind of rigorous inquiry and comparison groups and things like that. And so somebody who's very immersed in critical social justice or kind of wokeism might say, well, yes, so what if our worldview runs counter to those things? We don't trust those methods of inquiry anyways. Those are white male ways of knowing, or those are Eurocentric ways of knowing, or they simply kind of reinforce the status quo.
So you left the evangelical church. I'm sure maybe you'll tell us a little bit about this. You would probably would have had to face some social consequences in that, or family consequences, and now you're a progressive who is critiquing maybe the primary source of progressive ideology these days. I mean, are you going through a second breakup? I mean, tell us a little about, well, first of all, tell us about your first one, and then tell us if you're going through a second one.
So I do think they're related. So, by the time I completely stopped calling myself a Christian, I was already centered in a highly educated, highly secular community here in Seattle. And so that was a fairly benign transition for me, in contrast to other people. You can go to xchristian.net and read testimonials of people who were rejected by their families, who kind of, when had no community but their church community, when they broke off with Christianity and basically had to start from scratch, sometimes without an education, because they'd been part of a sect that didn't value education. So I had it really particularly easy in that regard. Not that it was painless. There are just simply some conversations my family and I choose not to have together. I have two evangelical siblings and two who are now somewhere on the agnostic atheist spectrum, and so it can be a spicy stew if we all get together. But that said, then when I think about this, kind of the ways that I am kind of questioning some now progressive orthodoxies in the community around me, I feel like one way that that's related is that I feel like I've done that groupthink thing, right? I've been in a context where you're only allowed to ask questions up to a certain point. I've been in I've lived in communities where you kind of, if you have opinions that seem to kind of be the thing that you've come to based on your own struggle, and your own deep moral values, that you have to keep those ideas to yourself. And I'm just not going to do it again. I also have the luxury that I think a lot of people don't have, which is I do have a platform. I've been writing for online news and opinion sites for a decade. All of my articles are archived at valerietarico.com and available there. But I was writing for places like Salon and Truth Out and the Huffington Post and Raw Story. And so I had an audience, and I felt, but I was doing all of that for free because I can afford to right now. And so I didn't have a whole lot to lose, in contrast to other people who might have been as deeply engaged as progressive activists, but who needed to earn a living or had some kind of institutional reputation that they felt a responsibility to protect, right? Where they were worried about cutting off relationships with donors or supporters, or undermining their own ability to accomplish something important, like climate change work or voter, democracy reform or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Have you had to make ex-friends in this process, or have your friends who continue to be progressive stayed with you?
Most of my friends have stayed with me. I've definitely been called a Karen on Facebook. I've definitely had people, unfriend me on social platforms. I think there are people in our community who are wary of me, and I did break some relationships recently when our amazing director of our local Planned Parenthood affiliate, who has just been a rock star. She's one of the reasons, Chris Charbonneau, she's one of the reasons that Planned Parenthood nationally has their own drug company so that they can control pricing. She's one of the reasons they have a telemedicine service. She's one of the reasons that they have a model for peer counseling among teenagers that has gotten replicated across the country. And she has probably done more in the Northwest region to ensure that poor and minority women have access to contraception, more than anyone. And she was recently lost her job abruptly, defenestrated because a donor used the N-word during a meeting with Chris and someone else, said that women in Texas are like the new N-word. And then Chris described that conversation behind closed doors to another staff member, which ultimately resulted in her losing her job. And at a time when here we are trying to kind of ramp up services to provide for women from Idaho and Montana who are going to lose their abortion access, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of lost my I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this program, but I lost it because that is just, I lost my shit. It's just like, that is a perfect example of form over function, of righteous purity over actually caring about what it takes to roll up your sleeves and create genuine equality on the ground. Yeah, I've broken some relationships recently, and I'm kind of ready to be there.
Right. So I feel your pain. Here, I just had a conversation about an hour before this one with a couple academics who I probably agreed with on, let's say, 80 or 90% of the policy issues. If you went down the line from choice to criminal justice reform to immigrant rights and so forth, we're probably on the same page. And yet, the fact that I in their view, make common cause with the people who say there's a problem with the teaching of critical race ideologies in schools. Even though I'm not trying to ban it from the state, that's not my stance, not my organization's stance. I'm still critical of it being taught in a monolithic way. I think that the kids should read both Ibrahim X. Kendi and John McWhorter, right? They shouldn't just hear Kendi. And I think that would give them allow them to have more critical conversations than they're able to have today. And yet they couldn't even have a conversation. They wanted to define me off the reservation. They wanted to make me so that I'm not of the left, even though that's where I've always positioned myself or thought of myself. And I'm wondering how you deal with it. Like, do you now say to yourself, well, if you don't want me on the left, I'm not on the left, but I'll still support whatever issues I do? Or are you saying, I am on the left and I'm going to try to reclaim my place in the left? Where do you come down on that?
Well, so every once in a while, I say to my daughters, I can't stand it. I think I'm becoming conservative. And they laugh at me because they know my values. When we sit down at the end of the year to write our checks, my husband and I, the biggest checks that we're writing go to family planning access, climate change, Van Jones, who's work, in his work on prison reform and and helping to ensure that people in inner cities are not left out of the tech transition or the green collar jobs transition. Stacey Abrams, and her work to ensure that people aren't being voting rights. Exactly. So at a tangible, practical level, it's not like I fit anywhere on the right. And I frankly think that the right has gone off a cliff. I just am frustrated that it seems to be that some folks on the left are wanting to take us off the other side of the catwalk, right? So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I do think, like, in 2018, I wrote an article about political narrative and title, kind of why some progressives are tearing each other apart, in which I contrasted traditional social liberal democracy with kind of critical theory based identitarian kind of politics. And like, I continue to think that the first two of those is just simply a better approach to accomplishing in the long run what we want to accomplish on the left. For one thing, just at a practical level, if we are saying to young white men, there's no place for you in our aspirational future, you just need to take kind of bend over at the back of the line because people who look like you have had it way too good for too long. Should we really, Van Jones has said this, should we really be surprised then that they kind of start looking to white supremacy groups where they are welcomed with a sense of kind of respect and dignity and told that they actually matter and their anxieties, their economic struggles, that their deaths of despair matter?
Right. The worst thing you could tell a white person who lived in a former manufacturing town with an opioid addiction is that they have privilege, and to argue that somehow that they're complicit in a white supremacy order is not going to make friends. It's not going to make allies in any kind of political struggle. It's going to alienate people, and it's going to probably drive them to the right or extreme right. And I guess that that sort of practical message is being lost on people. They just want to see it as, well, that's just because they're being manipulated by the right. They don't want to take any responsibility in their own actions and rhetoric that might actually lead to that result.
Yeah, so there's both a pragmatic issue here, like it's not going to win elections. There's also a moral issue here when it comes to kind of grounding ourselves in our shared humanity, in being able to recognize the suffering of people, regardless of their skin color, regardless of what genitalia they have, and regardless of kind of what happened to people who look like them. Whether we're talking about the descendants of slaves or we're talking about the descendants of coal miners, we're talking about the descendants of oligarchs, right? That to treat people as if they were simply proxies for other people who happen to look like them, who kind of are identified therefore as part of their tribe, it's profoundly, in my mind, immoral. It violates what I think of as the very best of our spiritual traditions, including Christianity, including the kind of Christianity that I came out of, and which, and when you look at kind of what is universal in those religious traditions, it's typically some form of the golden rule. It's about being able to recognize in ourselves and sometimes just in, okay, the males of our own tribe, they should get treated as if kind of by according to the golden rule. If you go on the other end of the spectrum to Jainism, it is about all sentient beings. But I think that is kind of the convergence point in humanity's moral code. And a lot of what we're doing in the name of political expedience or in the name of kind of inverting the hierarchies of oppression really negates that.
Mm. Yeah, I had a conversation with a very high level Jewish rabbinical figure, rabbi, who's a sophisticated person. And it was interesting. We were talking about the liberalism, and he's somebody who might be moderately sympathetic to what I'm arguing, but thinks that there still are power structures and believes that the critique of liberalism is legitimate, that it's preserving these power structures. And I tried to understand, what do you think will replace liberalism? I don't understand what you think the replacement idea is, as Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology. Like, what do you think is going to succeed it? When you say that people are no longer, that liberalism, the idea that we can have a free expression of ideas, is the fundamental operating system of society, if that's no longer the case, who's going to decide what other people get to say and don't say? And who has power and who doesn't have power? I just don't understand how there's any replacement to liberalism that would allow for a thriving democratic society. And I'm not sure. I'm sometimes not sure that these folks, at least I think the more radical among them, want complete upheaval. But I'm not sure that the more moderate among them even have a theory for what society would be like if you actually scrapped liberalism.
Yeah, it's a sense of, instead of kind of saying what's the solution, it's a focus on the problem and it's a focus on atonement, right? So that I think, was it Eric Smith that you interviewed back in the summer, who kind of, was kind of there was a conversation about, are we actually looking to kind of provide some kind of, self-flagellation, gratification for certain kinds of white folks at the expense of Black people who really need us to instead be focused on solutions, on rolling up our sleeves, on figuring out better, kind of better prison systems, getting rid of the war on drugs, figuring out how do we teach in a better way for kids who might be struggling with literacy, how do we ensure that every child comes into the world under the best possible circumstances available to their family, right, by allowing women to delay and limit their pregnancies, my big thing, right? So you ask, are we actually doing the things that help people to attain dignity and equality, or are we just, to what extent are we engaged in an elitist, self-gratifying form of navel gazing, which ends up harming people, who need practical help, including people in therapy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to come full circle. It strikes me, though, one other thing I want to say before we sort of wrap it up is that that this language is also sort of being, this woke ideology is also being grafted on traditional religious traditions as well. I mean, I faced a lot of the flack that I've gotten from progressive rabbis who latch on to some of the religious elements, some of the atonement elements, and bring it into Judaism as if it's always been there, as if it was written into the Torah or itself. And I think the same, by the way, is happening in segments of evangelical Christianity. And so while on the one hand, it might be because religious tradition is receding that we're seeing these new religions, secular religions, come into being. But it also may be that some aspects of those religious traditions actually combine with woke ideology in sort of in a new theology. Have you thought about that at all? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, even more so than Judaism, Christianity is a highly mutating form of religion, right? That's kind of, much more its survival mechanism. And it's the reason that there are literally tens of thousands of different denominations within Christianity. So it shouldn't be surprising that that is happening. But I see it as kind of almost a reciprocal circular influence, right? So when you look at the kind of the woke focus on original sin, essentially, right? That this inborn sin of being born with a specific race and or out of a specific kind of like historic tradition, and universal sin that like there's no way to get away from it, right? That when you look at this, the fatalism of that, and the denial of progress, that progress is even possible here on this earth, right? It's so weird to have progressives denying that we've made any progress, right? In other words, what's the point? But I do think a bunch of that actually comes out of American forms of Christianity.
Calvinism, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of a fatalistic tradition in a way. Yeah, probably wouldn't have turned the way it did if not for that. I mean, even some of this sort of idea, it's like a gospel in a way, that you're seeing the light. And I think it does emerge out of a Christian vernacular. So this has been it's been great. I'm sure I'm going to have more questions about how this intersects with therapy and your concerns, and maybe we should have spent more time there. Maybe we'll have you back on. Also, maybe in conversation with another therapist who shares some of your concerns and see what the back and forth produces. I think that would also be fascinating. But I really appreciate your insights and your writing, and I'd like to stay in close touch.
Thank you. We didn't talk a whole lot about the very concrete examples that I gave in terms of the contrast between woke thinking and the kinds of approaches to life and thinking that you get out of evidence-based therapies. But if people go to my website, valerietarico.com, and scan down a couple notches, they can find that article. And there's some very concrete examples there in those 4 areas of functioning that I talked about in terms of agency, emotional regulation, interpersonal relationships, and conflict. Right. So people should feel free to do that, because I didn't do a particularly good job of representing that information here in our conversation. And I'd be more than happy to come back again to talk about these issues with you and with another therapist.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.